Thank you, Madam Chair, and I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, ma'am. So again, my colleague on the other side of the aisle used the word invasion as many times as he could, even after my colleague from the state of Washington made, I think, an impassioned plea to moderate the tone of our public discourse on asylum seekers and migrants in our country. So it's unfortunate that the gentleman chose to be intentionally inflammatory. So I want to rise in strong opposition to this bill. Here we are in the Education and Workforce Committee marking up a bill that would strip federal funds from public elementary schools, public secondary schools, and even institutions of higher learning if they provide shelter or housing to undocumented immigrants. The Schools Not Shelter Act is an attempt by my colleagues across the aisle to focus on moral panic. And I can think of no greater disgrace than penalizing public institutions of learning, schools, for helping facilitate the safety of migrants seeking refuge in this country. The funding at stake here is federal grants, loans, direct appropriations, and even food commodities. Food commodities. We're talking about cheese and maybe milk and other types of food. Let's be honest and frank about what this legislation is. It's simply another flagrant attempt to pursue a culture war. This bill is about vilifying migrants. I hear my Republican colleagues clamor across the aisle about learning loss, claiming they want to remedy some of the lasting woes of the pandemic, but yet here we are today actually going as far as to remove federal funding from schools, going as far as to revoke funding that would actually be put toward learning loss. Taking away Title I funds would absolutely decimate learning loss or intensify or increase that learning loss for our children. This is there's quite a long history and precedent of K-12 schools being used to shelter people. Both FEMA and DHS deem these schools as viable options for congregate shelters. Interestingly enough, the legislation before us has specific language that exempts short-term emergency shelters made necessary by a specific disaster. This exemption makes abundantly clear what we already know. The Republicans on this committee want to punish schools only if they're helping migrants. There is no punitive action directed at these schools for opening up their doors for a weather-related emergency, commonly seen for hurricanes. The resolution last week and the legislation before us today has been only about opposing support for the migrant community. The objective is to target any attempts to shelter undocumented immigrants. What an outrageous waste of congressional committee time to focus its energies in such a cruel manner. The Schools Not Shelters Act politicizes public elementary and secondary schools and institutions of higher education while doing nothing to improve education and actively harming schools, students, and families. The legislation before us today does nothing more than direct attention to a hot-button issue that has been blown way out of proportion. There are an abundance of issues this committee could be tackling today, but frankly, this is not one of them. We can and should do better for our students, and I urge my colleagues to oppose this legislation, and I yield back.